you doing, Anne?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining. So I'm really excited to have you on to chat with my students about everything law school admissions, especially on the occasion of the launch of your fourth edition of your new book, Law School Admission Game. Pretty excited about that.
It's nice when it's done, and it's nice to have something that's up to date.
Yeah. There's been a lot of changes in recent years in the law school admissions world. And I haven't received the fourth edition yet, but I've got a few of the previous editions here.
Oh boy.
I've got the second edition. That's the second edition here.
Uh-huh.
And I've got, let's see what else, the first edition.
Wow.
And
how
then
many
I
of those
have
are you featured in?
the
Almost all of them.
The law school decision game. Yeah, probably at least a couple of them. And I know that I gave a little bit of a contribution for the fourth edition as well. I'm still waiting on my copy of that, but I'm excited to see that one too.
It exists. Here's what it looks like on Amazon. Okay.
And that just came out like a week ago, right?
Yeah. Gosh, what day are we? It's July, a week or two ago. So Law School of Michigan looks like this one with the blue. And I made a little political statement if you look closely, but you'll see. So it's my longest version yet. I have more sample essays this time, personal statements and diversity statements and things. And it's up to date, like per COVID situation and LSAT Flex and everything, GRE, all that good stuff. So it is as up to date as a law school admission book could possibly be.
Wow, that's fantastic. So you even worked in LSAT Flex. You even worked in how COVID affects everything. So very timely.
Well, I didn't work in how COVID affects everything.
Not everything. Nobody knows that.
But we can definitely talk about that and surmise how COVID is going to affect the future, because none of us have ever experienced this before. Neither have the law schools. And so everyone on the planet is winging it. But I'm comparing this situation a lot to the Great Recession of 2008. And I've been doing law school experting since 2004. So I remember 2008 very well. And I really see a lot of parallels.
Right. And you're speaking from experience because you worked in admissions at two different law schools, if I'm correct on that.
I did, but I started law school expert in 2004. So this is my 17th admission cycle helping people through the process rather than working for the schools. I'm older than I look. I get that a lot. But I definitely see some parallels. I think that the interesting thing is, so in 2008, it was actually the 2009 cycle that was really in demand for law schools, because when the recession happened, it was October and people didn't really have time to regroup and apply for law school immediately. That cycle that we were already in the middle of one. But that was different with COVID. With COVID happening in the spring and people having nothing better to do but study for the LSAT in the spring and summer, people are applying to law school as second careers who've always thought about law school. People who are home from college and nothing else to do are applying to law school, taking the LSAT. So I'm anticipating big demand just for those things applying this fall. But also what it will do is it means there are people who are deferring. There are people who are choosing not to attend this year because they don't want to go to law school online. There are people who are choosing to reapply. And so I think that this is going to be a crunch season. I'm getting a lot of questions, well, should I just wait out this season then? And the answer is maybe. The thing is this, I believe that if you want to go to law school now and you're qualified to go to law school now, you should apply to law school. And if you're not happy with your results and what's going on with competitiveness of the cycle, then wait, regroup and reapply. But don't sit out a year of your life that you'd rather be doing something else just because you're scared of the competition. Move forward, see what happens. That's all we can do. And the LSAT Flex is such an interesting opportunity. It's hard to let that go by. I think most of us, tell me what you think, are anticipating an August LSAT Flex.
Oh, almost certainly. There's no doubt about that in my view.
I think this fall it's going to be really hard to put 50 people in a room to take a test. And how do you do it in some states and not in others where infection rates are higher? So I think it's with us for a little bit, and people are liking it and doing well with it. So I think that it's a great opportunity. Plus, it doesn't count toward the 3 times you get to take the LSAT right now, although that rule is bound to change 100 times the next 5 days. I'm exaggerating. But, I think that this is kind of a neat time to be applying to law school if you want to go to law school. But it will be a high demand season.
Yeah, I certainly imagine so. Well, I appreciate your being on, Anne. I'm going to step out of the way and let you do your thing.
Oh, boy.
Folks, feel free to ask questions in the chat. Don't ask Anne anything too tough, although if you do, I'm sure she can handle it.
Ask me tough things. I don't like to be bored.
Yeah, keep it interesting.
Throw it at me. Steve asked me to do this about 2 hours ago when another speaker dropped out. So I'm totally winging this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each piece of the process, each piece of the application and the timeline, but I'm going to get diverted by whatever questions I see in chat that I think are interesting. So fire away. Starting by
Perfect. Take
talking
it
about
away, Anne.
timeline. Yeah, I'm a big believer in rolling admissions, the advantage of applying earlier, especially in a competitive cycle. So what that means is that if you're going to have the LSAT done on or before end of August, to submit all of your applications by end of September, very early October is really ideal. If you end up having to take the October LSAT, October 3rd, super early in the cycle as well. No disadvantage there. So the idea then would be to submit all applications by the beginning or middle of November. So I speak quickly, so feel free to chat questions quickly. I can take it. But the first things that I usually have people do are send their transcripts to LSAC, know what their LSAC GPA is. Your cumulative GPA is the guiding number. And then also go ahead and procure letters of recommendation and get those into LSAC. Both of those have pretty long lead times, and that's why I have people do those first. Right now, registrar's offices are slow with COVID, so you have to request your transcripts in advance. And also, letters of rec, people need a decent amount of time to write good letters for you. So do those things first. In addition to studying for the LSAT, I recommend really spending a lot of time on your resume. I probably talk more about law school resumes than anyone in the law school business. And I have a huge chapter on law school resumes in the book, because I believe it's the best opportunity you have to sell yourself in the application. The application itself in the form has very little space for you to describe anything. I mean, 40 characters, if that. So your resume is really the chance to show how you've spent your time, what you've been committed to, how many hours a week you worked well in school. All those little details matter. So great question. Is there an example of the resume in the book? There are examples of resumes in previous versions of my book. I did not include a sample resume in this version, but I included very extensive to-dos in this version, how to group activities together. I didn't put a sample resume in the book because I don't want people all follow one format, and I think that's a danger of samples. I don't really care what font you use as long as it's legible and consistent. I don't care about the template. In fact, the more simple the template, the better. The focus should really be on the substance of the resume. So that's where I focused on the book. So pay a lot of attention to your resume, plus simply the exercise of creating your resume and really going back and considering all the things you've done and how you spent your time since graduating from high school for most applicants, right? If you've been out for 20 years, you maybe don't go back that far, but for most applicants, it makes you go back through all of your experiences and really think about them and see patterns and describe things and group things. That's a great exercise for before you start brainstorming personal statements for two reasons. One, it makes you revisit themes and things that are important to you, things you've done, qualities you've exhibited, but also once you describe things really well on the resume, it frees up the personal statement to be a little more insightful and descriptive. 1 to 2 pages for a resume. Page resume. Very rarely have I recommended a 3-page resume for anyone, but 2 pages is usually okay if it's not because of white space and you're not spending time describing inane things that everyone knows what they are. It's not, again, it's quality, not quantity, but a 2-page resume is absolutely acceptable. And keep asking questions. I like the questions. Fire away. So go through the resume first, make sure that all the formatting is consistent, of course, include hours per week for things to show how much you can handle. If you've had multiple jobs or multiple areas of interest, you can separate those out with different headings. And I talk about that in the book as well, so that you don't look so random. If you just do it chronologically, it might not be clear that you have certain discrete interests. So you can group things and you can say, okay, these are my fashion industry interests and these are my immigration law interests, and you can kind of group things accordingly. It can help with packaging your experiences. Very few people are one-trick ponies, nor would you want to have a one-trick pony applying to law school. Well-rounded people is important. Having well-rounded people is important to law schools because law is an interdisciplinary field. So having some knowledge or expertise in multiple fields is good. It'll help you in law school and in your legal career. Okay, so moving on. Obviously, we're going to talk about personal statements a bit. And personal statements are tough because people have so many expectations of amazing personal statements and how, well, they haven't overcome paralysis or solved peace in the Middle East, so how are they going to write a personal statement? But really, I think that's way too high a threshold. It's not really about being unique when you're thinking of personal statement topics. It's about being authentic. And so I really want you to focus on that, on authentically, who are you, and what experiences bring you to law school and why. Be insightful, be authentic over being unique or memorable. Okay, I can't stress that enough. The personal statement needs to leave people with a positive impression of you. So if you're talking about something that is going to worry a law school, that's probably better off for a diversity statement or an addendum to show something you've overcome or something you struggled with would be more appropriate there. Personal statement should really be about something you've done of your own volition, your own initiative, rather than something that simply happened to you where you're passive. If you're talking about something that's happened to you and you're passive, it's probably closer to a diversity statement. So those are some tests you can use for content on the personal statement. The most important things for the personal statement are to avoid writing your own letter of recommendation. You don't want to sound cocky, like you're speaking highly of yourself, and you want to avoid conclusions and overgeneralizations. I'd rather and this is true in law school on your exams, and it's true in the practice of law, but you rely on facts to make an argument. And that's what you're doing in your law school personal statement. You're deciding which facts to include to make the point you're trying to make. So really focus on facts. I want to learn something about you from the beginning of the essay that makes me want to keep reading. I do not want a fancy hook. I don't want to feel like I'm reading a mystery novel from the beginning or a thriller. I simply want to learn something about you that makes me want to keep learning about you. So I'll answer a couple questions. I have a learning disability and wasn't sure if mentioning this in my personal statement would hinder my chances. I think that the answer comes down to why you would mention it. If you're showing it's an obstacle you've overcome, it may be more appropriate for a diversity statement. If you have a learning disability and use that to advocate for others with learning disabilities and you became very involved in these issues as an advocate, then that could be a personal statement. I think there's some nuance to it. Another question, if I'm in recovery from drugs and alcohol over 3 years and had to take 2.5 years away from university to make that happen, how should I address this? This is a great question. This would be in an addendum. And so what you would do, you have to, if you've had any interruptions in school, it's a question on the application. So you will submit an addendum explanation for what you did during that time. And it's awesome. You will be able to say that you'll be able to emphasize there the massive bump in your GPA after returning to school and cleaning yourself up. And that's a great thing. It's something law schools will have a lot of respect for. Keep asking questions, people. I like the questions. Going backward a little bit to the resumes, is it okay to include odd jobs that you took after graduating college? Yes, we need to show how you spent your time. And especially if you're a more recent graduate, law schools will expect some holes on resumes right now. They know that plans are canceled. They know that life is unpredictable right now. So also I would say that don't be ashamed of having like grunt work jobs on your resume, because actually it's something that law schools and employers respect, that you've had to work hard, roll up your sleeves, and that you know what hard work is. So don't feel like prestige is more important than substance. Okay. I think that's something that people often overlook. I'm going to talk a little bit about diversity statements. People often ask me, should I write a diversity statement if I'm X or Y? The test for whether you should write a diversity statement is really whether you're telling mostly your own story or mostly someone else's story. If you're mostly talking about your sibling or your parents or especially your grandparents and their struggles, then it's probably going to be hard to make that a really impactful diversity statement about you. If their struggles greatly impacted you through your educational opportunities, your socioeconomic status, the educational opportunities you had, meaning where you went to school, whether college was viable for you, financial opportunities, direct prejudice you received as a result of having immigrant parents, whatever those things may be, make sure the focus of the diversity statement is on you and your lived experience and the perspective that you bring to law school. I'm not someone who believes everyone should write a diversity statement. I'm someone who believes that everything in the application should add credibility to who you are as an individual. So if the diversity statement injures your credibility because it feels like a reach, then I usually stay away from it. Any questions about diversity statements? Throw that up. Talking about addenda a bit, which I talked about in response to the question regarding time away from school to become sober, there are a few things in the application that you have to draft addenda about. That's one of them. If you've had a character and fitness issue, an honor code violation, academic probation, those are things that law schools specifically ask you about that you will have to address. That's called a mandatory addendum. You don't have a choice. You have to address that to the law schools. Again, rely on facts. Facts are important. They establish credibility rather than emotional pieces about how it completely changed your life the time you got a minor in possession ticket, which no, it didn't. It was one minor in possession ticket. It's not a big deal. Just facts and walk away. There are some issues you may decide to share with the law school in a discretionary addendum, meaning an addendum you choose to share with the law schools to provide context to something else in your application. So for example, if you had a year of bad grades because you were taking care of a family member that year, or you had to work 50 hours a week that year to pay your tuition because your family, someone in your family lost their job. Those, or multiple LSAT scores where there's a strange pattern, or things like that you want to show something about yourself, an upward trend in grades, or a change of major that might not be evident and that impacted your grades, then that would come out in the optional addendum or discretionary addendum. And again, you want to stick to facts and be brief. A diversity statement would be 1 to 2 pages for most schools, double spaced. And an addendum is going to be pretty brief. In most cases, we're talking a paragraph or 2, except in very rare circumstances where people have multiple issues that they're addressing. But for the most part, 1 or 2 incidents, a dorm infraction, or a minor possession charge, we're talking about a couple of sentences. Feel free to ask more questions. The questions are great. We'll talk a little bit about how, so all of these pieces of the application that I've talked about, the contents of those pieces don't change based on where you are applying to law school. So those are things you can work on before you know your LSAT score, before you've decided where to apply. Once you know your LSAT score and you're deciding where to apply, you have decisions to make, obviously. So you should put together your schools list based on location, ranking, and price. And everybody's priorities of those 3 things are different. And I would also say, based on my many years of working with thousands of people, that those priorities change through an application cycle. At the beginning of the cycle, most people, I would say 90% of people care about ranking. And at the end of the cycle, 90% of people care about debt. Suddenly it feels very real. And so because of that, I really urge people to only apply under a binding decision program when they really, really mean it. They have to be really sure that they're willing to go to that school above all others, no matter what other money comes their way and no matter what it would cost. Because that's a pretty big decision. At the beginning of the cycle, it's like, oh, I would do anything to get into NYU. And then at the end of the cycle, oh, I've gotten into NYU binding, I have to go. And I have to turn down that really great scholarship to whatever other law school. That's tough. That's really, really tough. So be really sure about yourself before you decide to apply binding. But if you do apply binding, if your numbers are close to a school, but a little low, and you really want to give yourself the best opportunity to get into a particular school you'd be committed to attending, then binding is a great way to go. So consider that. And different schools have different binding deadlines. So many are in the fall early, and others are graduated throughout the cycle. Some have 2 waves. So there might be first round binding in the fall and second round binding in January, for example. Or it could be like Georgetown, where they've traditionally had binding open through their entire application cycle. So almost, I think, through March. So you can take a look at some of that, and you can actually game that a little bit and say, okay, my first choice is UVA. If I don't get in there under the first round, then I'll apply to Cornell second round, right? You can play with that a bit. But again, you always have to be willing to pay full price at whatever that law school is. Okay, so, and I'd always rather someone wait and have a better LSAT score than apply binding with a lower LSAT score. So if that's what you're thinking about, if you're like, oh, I'm going to apply binding with whatever score I have by October 3rd, but I'm still going to take the LSAT in November, that makes no sense whatsoever. Don't do that. Okay. I find that there's a line from the movie Sweet Home Alabama, trying to ride two horses with one ass. Like, it doesn't really work in the law school application process. You got to pick a strategy and go with it, and make good decisions accordingly. Talking a little bit about how many schools to apply to. That will really depend upon your goals and your credentials. So for example, if it's very important to you to have scholarship offers, you're going to apply to more schools where your numbers are in the middle and high. If it's more important to you to get into the best school possible, you're going to weigh more reach schools into your schools list. If you are basing your applications locally, you want to be in a certain region or town, you'll have fewer applications to go out, and that's okay. So there's not really one set number that I tell people you should apply to this number of schools. I think it's different for everyone's goals. But I generally recommend that you keep your options open at the beginning of the cycle when you're applying. A lot of times people say, oh, I'm going top 5 or bust, or I'm not going to law school. And then they kind of regret that later, usually, that they didn't give themselves more options. So better to apply to more schools in the beginning and give yourself options for later than to narrow yourself so much and not have options, especially during a competitive admission cycle where it will be a little bit harder to predict this year where people will get in and what schools will do, especially at the top law schools. I feel like I've been talking to myself because I can't see any of you. So feel free to ask more questions in the chat. I'll talk for maybe, it's 5:22, I'll talk 8:22 your time. I'll talk for maybe 8 more minutes about things, and then I'll just answer questions from there as well. I'll talk a little bit about letters of recommendation. The most important thing for a letter of recommendation is, again, credibility. So you want someone who can write about who you are as a student or who you are as an employee. Someone who supervised you in those capacities is really ideal. The family friend letter or the prestigious senator that your parents know or what have you is not very interesting or helpful to law schools. Law schools want to hear a voice in your application from someone who they will place weight in, who says, yes, this person is really outstanding. And so that's what we want. So try to get at least one academic letter. If you're out of school for 3 or more years, that may be really difficult, and that's okay. An employment letter or 2 is fine and great. If you have to go back a job or 2, that's okay too. Sometimes you don't want to let your current employer know you're leaving. That's fine. And sometimes it's hard because people aren't employed right now and you're going to classes online. So it's really hard for you to build those relationships to get letters of recommendation. So go the extra mile to continue to build those relationships so that your letters are helpful to your admission process. You can have as many letters as you wish almost, sent to LSAC, and then you can decide later how to assign them to different schools. So don't worry too much about that, and they should not be school specific, except in very rare circumstances. So your recommenders don't need to know where you're applying. They don't need to know your LSAT score, okay? I'm making sure I haven't skipped any questions in the chat box. Okay. You want your letters of recommendation submitted to LSAC before you submit your applications. So just time things out that way. It's the reason why I said in the beginning, that's one of the first things I would want you to do is request your letters of recommendation. What else can I tell you? People often want to know about wait lists and interviews. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and that'll get us to that 30-minute mark. Many schools now are incorporating interviews. Sometimes they're recorded Kira interviews where you're not talking to an actual person and you're recording your responses. And sometimes they're actual video interviews. And so many of you will have that opportunity. And I have some practice questions for that in the book, but just be cognizant of that. At a few schools, you sign up for an interview at the time you apply, but in most schools, you're invited to interview after you apply. I'll turn to the chat box with some questions. Should you send a summary of your qualifications to the person writing your letter of recommendation? Generally, no. Generally, what you want to send to the person writing your letter of recommendation are bullet points to remind them of things you'd like them to say in the letter, things they can speak to that they've witnessed about you firsthand. If you hand them a bunch of things that are about something else entirely, they can't write about those things credibly in the letter. You want them to write about things that they've witnessed firsthand about you, the papers you wrote for them, the projects you did for them, how you impressed them. So you can give them a summary of those things, give them copies of work you did, But don't give them things that don't relate to what they should be writing about. If they ask for them, and you kind of are obligated to give it to them, but it's not ideal. Is there a rough number of credible letters you'd recommend submitting? Well, most schools, the minimum letters of recommendation they want is 2, and some schools will accept up to 4. If a school gives you the option of a number of letters beyond 2, just remember, you want everything in the application to be really strong. So if you know 2 letters are strong, you're not sure the third one's that great, only submit the ones you know are really strong. Don't let one thing pull down the rest of the application. Okay. So let's see, we covered letters of rec, we covered interviews a little bit. You'll want to practice for those if you get to that point. And we're very far from having to talk about waiting lists. And in a competitive admission cycle, waiting lists aren't really, generally don't move all that terribly much. So we'll see what happens next cycle. I'm happy to take additional questions. Guys, if there aren't additional questions, then I'm just going to talk for 3 more minutes and end. So here's your chance to ask questions. So I just want to list some things you might consider writing an addendum about, okay? Mandatory addendum topics have to be, are academic probation, school interruption, character and fitness, okay? Honor code violations, disciplinary incidents, sometimes speeding tickets, something you can choose to describe, LSAT scores, GRE, why you took the GRE, if you're not a good standardized test taker, trends in grades, etc. I have in the book brainstorming for personal statement questions that you can try. I also have brainstorming exercises in the book and sample essays. So you can check that out for more information there. A couple more questions. Since we can't see the letter of recommendation, how do you decide which is good? Good question. By the enthusiasm of the writer and how happy they are to do this for you is one way. If you have to chase them down, then you can kind of guess it may not be as enthusiastic. You have to gauge it that way a little bit, and also just how well you know the person and trust them. How would you recommend considering when deciding which law schools to attend? So this all comes down to your priorities in terms of location, ranking, and price. When you see where you've gotten in, you're going to have to weigh those options. Do you think there will be significant fallout from the lack of international students traveling to the US? So if law schools go online, there'll be less fallout. If law schools try to meet in person or do a hybrid, there'll be more fallout. But I think that either way, this is going to be a competitive admission cycle for a lot of those reasons. In some ways, if people can't get student visas and things, I mean, we still have an election coming up, so God only knows what it's going to be like for people trying to come here. If we're not allowed in Europe, for example, I don't think very many Europeans are going to be allowed here. So we have all of these things where we don't know how full law schools are really going to be. Not that there are a lot of students coming from Europe, but China would be a better example, right? People are coming from China to go to law schools in the US. So if we have issues with China and they can't get here, that's going to make more spots available elsewhere, but it's a whole disaster. Curious, here we go. Apart from your professor and employer, can you have your mentor who's known you in school employment write a letter of recommendation? Yes, but I prefer for it not to be strictly a character reference. But yes, if they're qualified to write you a letter, that's fine. Curious what you recommend if my GPA is so bad that even a 165 won't get me into most schools on your list. Then you're gonna have to change your list. Yeah. You may just have to change your list, and you may have to be someone who proves themselves at a lower ranked law school, for example, and maybe does really well and gets to transfer. But it's important to be realistic about your list. You can, of course, explain any factors for why your GPA is slower. There's a lot you can do with that, but you can't ignore the fact that you have a low GPA, because I'd always rather have a high GPA and a low LSAT than the opposite. So it can be kind of tough. Okay, I'll give 1 more minute to answer questions. I also have a lot of, at Law School Expert on Instagram, at Law School Expert, I've been posting a lot of videos from Q&As that I've been doing. So I've been taking questions that have been posed to me, and I've been answering them at Law School Expert on Instagram. So follow me there and check out some of those, because I'm guessing that a lot of the questions I've been answering there will correspond to questions that you have as well. And let's see, let's see what else. What if changing my list means that okay, that question is not complete yet. I'll wait a moment. So definitely check that out and follow me there. And I also answer questions there as well, in addition to on my blog, lawschoolexpert.com. I hope the book is helpful and that you guys like it. I look forward to hearing your feedback and reviews since it just came out. So make sure you're getting the 4th edition. And here's the 2 more questions. I decided to get a 2nd degree to increase my GPA. That doesn't work. It's the first GPA that the law schools will calculate. You can point to the 2nd bachelor degree in an addendum as evidence of better performance, but your first bachelor degree is the one that LSAC will count. It's here. Okay, Steve put the link into the book. There you go. And the Instagram. Thanks, Steve. Okay. I hope this is helpful. I look forward to hearing your feedback in it. And again, I'm happy to answer questions. And if you're looking for more personalized assistance through the process, you can go to lawschoolexpert.com. I do have a lot of information there about how I help applicants through the process. And I have a contact form. You can say that you met me here through All Set Unplugged and Steve. And I'm happy to follow up with you that way as well.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.